This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company. With me now, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Andrew Leigh, and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo. First of all, on the debt ceiling, Steve Ciobo, you heard what Bill Shorten had to say. He wants Joe Hockey to be up front, provide the mid-year economic update, and then they'll talk turkey when it comes to increasing the debt ceiling to $500 billion. Why don't you do that?
You know, there's nothing up front about Labor's position on this, Kieran. The reality is this. The Labor Party knows on their own figures that debt is going to peak at around $370 billion. We have the tabled Treasury Minute, which came from the Australian Office of Financial Management, which shows that debt will increase, that you need a buffer of between 40 and 60 billion. So just on the most basic facts, Labor already knows that debt is 370 plus a buffer of 60 is 430 billion. Now, Labor's approach on this is to try to say, look, we're reasonable people. We just want to see the Liberal Party's numbers. But that's not what it's about. What Labor wants to do is kick the can down the road, exactly the same as what the Tea Party was doing in the United States, saying, let's kick the can down the road, let's kick the can down the road. We'll revisit it again in 12 months or 24 months. We don't want to do that. That's not our approach.
Okay, let's go to Andrew on this, because I want to put the same question to you as an economist that I put to the opposition leader. And if that is, if Martin Parkinson, the head of Treasury, endorses the view put by Mr. Ciobo and Mr. Hockey, surely you've got to listen to that.
But Kieran, this is about transparency. It's about knowing which of the decisions of the government are beginning to blow out the debt. The implications, for example, of their going soft on multinationals profit shifting, taking $700 million out of revenue. The implications of their big tax cut to Gina Rinehart and Clive Palmer, again, which will blow out the debt. Fundamentally, Kieran, we have Joe Hockey, who came into Parliament, said he would like a no-doc loan for $500 trillion, and Parliament came back and said, well, if you're not giving any documentation, we'll give you $400 billion, $400 billion, which will give you a $30 billion buffer when debt peaks in 3 years' time.
In 3 years' time.
So it's very, very comfortable.
So we're talking about 3 years down the track.
I want to know, why is it that Andrew's ignoring this Treasury Minute that was tabled by the member for Lilly? I mean, you can see there's $370 billion, right? You can see there's $370 billion. And this minute says you need 40 to 60 billion. So there's 430 billion right there. Why are you pretending that doesn't exist?
But this is in 2016.
This is in 2016 and you've got a $30 billion buffer, right?
You don't have 30 billion. No, you don't have 30 billion because this minute, which was tabled by the member for Lilly, indicates that you need a 60 billion buffer. So there's 430 billion. And the reason why, Kieran, is exactly as I said, we don't want to kick the can down the road. Now, I understand Labour's skepticism.
Why do we need a debt ceiling at all, though? I've spoken to a number of economists on this program who say, including the former Liberal leader John Hewson, sure. I know Chris Richardson has argued, we don't need the debt limit. The budget provides the appropriation bills and authorises the spending of money. Why do we have this artificial ceiling?
I'll tell you why I believe in a debt ceiling, and the reason I believe in it is because I don't trust, frankly, politicians of all different colours to be able to restrain their spending. And we've seen that, for example, in the United States and in a number of countries in Europe where debt to GDP levels have exceeded 100% of GDP. I think a debt ceiling is a logical thing to do. It's a nice physical barrier, so to speak, to governments unnecessarily increasing debt, purely because they think that there's votes in it, or they can continue with largesse out there in the community. And the key point I'd make about the difference between our approach and Labor's approach, Kieran, is this. As a government, ours is a debt limit, not a debt target. Labor reached their debt ceiling every single time because it was effectively treated as a debt target. We need $500 billion, not as a target, but because we need to be able to manoeuvre around where our peak debt levels are going.
Are you worried that, Andrew Leigh, we're heading down the US path of this becoming a political football?
Not at all, Kieran. I mean, it's very clear that with a $400 billion debt cap, there's no risk of government default whatsoever. Plenty to pay the bills now.
Politics of this is the point.
But the fundamental point here, Kieran, is that we don't want Joe Hockey to be able to trash the 2013-14 budget and then blame it on the Labor Party. What he's clearly intending to do, for example, by giving $9 billion to the Reserve Bank of Australia, is to load as many expenses as he can into 2013-14, and then, like a coach who's taken over a quarter of the way into the season, blame his predecessor when it comes to finals time.
But why shouldn't he?
Well, because he is the
You've been in office for 6 years.
He is the Treasurer of Australia, and he is responsible for his decisions.
But to this point, the debt is Labor debt, isn't it?
Well, the debt that's been taken on is jobs debt. It's debt that we took on to save 200,000 jobs in the global financial crisis.
I want to move on. I don't want to go over the GFC again, but I think we've discussed that issue fair enough today. I want to ask you about Alan Joyce and his concerns about the $350 million capital injection into Virgin Australia. He's worried about predatory state-owned airlines, again, seeking to undercut Qantas. This is in the Financial Review this morning. Steve Ciobo, what do you make of the comments by the Qantas chief?
Well, look, I understand Qantas's frustration. I guess to some extent Qantas feels that they're hamstrung because they've got to effectively keep all their operations domestic in terms of capital raising. They don't have the opportunity for significant amounts of foreign investment, and that contrasts with Virgin. But the reality is that it's a competitive marketplace. I'm sure that Qantas will advance arguments about why they'd like an easing up on foreign investment restrictions into their airline. But by the same token...
Is that what this is about in its entirety, or are they asking you to provide, a crackdown on Virgin Australia and the fact that it's recognised as an Australian carrier?
Well, look, I mean, you'd need to ask Alan Joyce that question. I just, as an observer of the process, as someone who's watching what's taking place, it seems to me that in basic terms that Qantas says, well, we want more access to capital and we'd like foreign investment restrictions lifted under the Qantas Sale Act. Virgin,
do you think they should be able to do that?
Well, I'm not going to get into that. I mean, that'll be a decision that'll be taken if that was to come up as a proposal. We'll see in due course. I'm not going to comment on any specifics in terms of foreign investment, obviously.
Your thoughts on this?
Well, you can understand, Kieran, why Steve is nervous around the issue of foreign investment, given the huge fissure that's arising in the coalition at the moment.
Good segue.
On GrainCorp. Oh, look, I mean, I'm an open markets guy. I share Steve's broad perspective that politicians shouldn't be too concerned if Australian firms are raising capital offshore or onshore. But I do think that this, like the issue of the GrainCorp acquisition, is going to be a major issue for the coalition. Now that you've got Barnaby Joyce about to become the leader of the Nationals within a couple of years, that's really going to drive a fissure through the party. I don't know if people notice this, Kieran, but the current leader of the Nationals...
I love the crystal ball.
The current leader of the Nationals, Warren Truss, walked out of Parliament partway through Barnaby Joyce's maiden speech, just at the point where Barnaby started talking about how he could be great leadership material.
Okay, let's move on. Well, this is a serious issue to conclude with, but I want to get Steve Ciobo's thoughts particularly on this. It was quite a contrast from Tony Abbott on the message of human rights in Sri Lanka to that of David Cameron, a fellow Conservative. What did you think of the way that David Cameron handled it, for example, vis-a-vis the PM?
Well, look, I'm not going to comment on particular comments made by David Cameron other than to say this, and that is that Australia's approach with Sri Lanka is to recognise it as an important Commonwealth friend, cousin, whatever phrase you want to use. Obviously, Sri Lanka is emerging from decades of war. There's been a lot of progress made thus far. There's still obviously a lot more progress to be made. No one's going to pretend that there's a clean slate. Indeed, basically any country around the world, of course, has got, to some extent, various soilings on their slate at different periods.
Bill Shorten specifically pointed out a comment that Tony Abbott made on torture, that difficult things happen in difficult circumstances, or words to that effect.
Sure. Well, I mean, terrible things do happen in wartime. I think what's important is what the attitude is emerging from it. There's a number of inquiries that are taking place, as I understand, within Sri Lanka now. There's the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission that's taking place. So clearly Sri Lanka is focused on trying to right past wrongs, and I think that that's to be welcomed.
We've only got about 30 seconds left, but the point that Tony Abbott and Steve Ciobo is making is essentially that it's better to be constructive and respectful rather than to lecture fellow Commonwealth countries like Sri Lanka. What's your opinion on this?
Kieran, I think whenever we're overseas, we convey Australian values to our audience, and I think it is vital that as Australians we are absolute that we do not accept torture, even in difficult circumstances. I think David Cameron conveyed a message not just to Sri Lanka, but also to the broader world about the values that Britain stands for. And I was sorry not to see Mr Abbott doing that. And it's so ironic, isn't it, after the comments he was making about the importance of human rights in Malaysia and the immigration debate, that now he seems perfectly happy to give boats to the Sri Lankan military.
Andrew Leigh, Steve Ciobo, thanks, gents.
Thanks, Kieran.
A quick break, we'll be right back.